Imagine you're sitting in a really bustling hospital room. Like it's a high-stakes environment,
Oh,
right?
yeah, monitors beeping, people rushing by, total chaos.
Exactly. And a doctor is writing up a chart, maybe calling out an order for an injection to a nurse over all that noise. In that specific moment, I want to pose a question to you, the listener.
Hmm.
What difference does a single vowel make?
I mean, it's really tempting to assume that one letter just gets swallowed up in all that noise, you
Ah.
know? Like you'd think a slight slip of the tongue, an A instead of an E, is just a minor typo in the grand scheme of things.
Right. But when it comes to medical terminology, that one single vowel can literally be the difference between a routine treatment and a catastrophic medical error.
It really can.
So today we are opening up this massive dossier of sources. We're covering linguistic history, clinical applications, some pretty fierce scientific debates, and real-world patient safety data. And it is all centered around one incredibly crucial distinction, which is the medical prefixes inter and intra.
And I know it sounds incredibly niche at first glance, like just some tiny grammatical quirk. But our goal for you today is to really decode this secret language of medicine. We want to show you how mastering just a one-letter difference acts as this massive shortcut.
Yeah, it turns you into a deeply informed patient, and honestly, a much sharper consumer of the news you read every day. Okay, let's unpack this. We need to start with the physical, literal definitions of these prefixes to establish this overarching concept of boundaries in the human body.
Right. Boundaries are key here.
To keep this grounded for you, let's think about a massive modern apartment building. Intra is everything happening contained entirely inside your specific apartment unit. So your private Wi-Fi, the plumbing isolated in your bathroom, the air in your living room, it's totally self-contained. But inner true. That represents the infrastructure connecting the distinct apartments together. It's the shared hallway, the intercom system linking Unit 4A to Unit 4B.
I mean, that is an excellent way to conceptualize it. The core distinction is fundamentally about cardinality and containment. Inter, spelled with an E, means between or among two or more distinct things.
Right.
For example, in human anatomy, an intercostal nerve is a nerve that physically runs in the space between two separate ribs. The ribs are the distinct entities, and the nerve just bridges the gap.
While intra, with an A, implies something entirely different.
It does. Intra means within, inside, or contained by a single bounded thing. So an intramuscular injection goes directly into the belly of one specific muscle. The needle doesn't cross over the fascia into the surrounding tissues. It stays totally within the boundary.
I am curious, though, about where these tiny but mighty words actually come from. Because, I mean, doctors didn't just wake up in the 20th century and invent them to make med school harder, right?
No, not at all. These are ancient linguistic tools. They are direct descendants of classical Latin, but their DNA traces back even further than that. Inter originates from the Proto-Indo-European root in, which simply meant in. Yeah, it's the exact same ancient sound that eventually evolved into everyday English words like, enter and interior. Meanwhile, intra evolved from a very old Latin grammatical structure called an ablative construction.
Wait, I have to pause you there because ablative construction sounds like something that requires a degree in linguistics to understand. How does that actually work?
Fair point, fair point. In Latin grammar, the ablative case was used to express separation or location, answering questions like by what or where. Over centuries of spoken Latin, a specific phrase meant to describe being strictly on the inside of a boundary got mashed together. It contracted into the single prefix intra.
Oh, so it was basically slang that became official.
Sort of, yeah. So even thousands of years ago, when Latin was still spoken in the streets of Rome, these two prefixes had already specialized into near opposites.
But taking ancient street Latin and applying it to the human body in a strict, standardized way must have been a nightmare. According to the dossier, the history of naming human anatomy was pure, unadulterated chaos for centuries.
Oh, it was a mess. The historical record describes a complete lack of global standardization. You had the Renaissance anatomist Andreas Vesalius back in 1543, who started laying the groundwork for Latin as the universal language. He wanted scholars to have a common tongue.
Right.
But fast forward to the late 19th century, and the system had fractured entirely.
I'm trying to picture what that chaos actually looked like in a practical setting. Like, what did that mean for a doctor?
Well, imagine being a visiting surgeon in 1890. A single anatomical structure, say a specific ligament in the hand, could have 5 completely different names depending on whether you were reading a medical journal from France, Germany, Italy, or England.
Yikes.
Yeah, sometimes structures were named after the doctor who discovered them, sometimes after their shape, sometimes just in local dialects.
That seems incredibly dangerous. Like, you could be reading a breakthrough surgical technique from Berlin, but because you trained in London, you might literally not know which blood vessel they're telling you to cut.
Exactly. It was entirely unsustainable for a modernizing scientific world. So in 1895, an international committee of prominent anatomists convened in Basel, Switzerland, and they produced this landmark document called the Basel Nomina Anatomica, or BNA.
Okay, so finally some rules.
Yes, this was the very first serious, coordinated attempt to strip away the regional dialects. They wanted to give every structure in the human body one single, standardized Latin name.
Mm-hmm.
And a massive part of that effort was locking down prefixes like inter and interstrict, non-negotiable geometric meanings.
So everyone was on the same page.
Right. They needed a map where coordinates meant the same thing to every doctor on Earth.
And that rigorous standardization leads us to one of the most mind-bending examples in our sources today. I want to look at the body's fluid compartments. We generally know that roughly 60% of an adult's body weight is water, right? And 2/3 of that is intracellular, meaning water held inside the boundaries of the cells themselves. But then we have the extracellular fluid, the water outside the cells. And this is where our prefixes come into play, because extracellular fluid splits into a classic intra-pair.
It splits precisely along those boundary lines. You have interstitial fluid, which is the fluid sitting in the spaces between the cells, and you have intravascular fluid, which is contained entirely within the tubes of the blood vessels, which we colloquially call blood plasma.
Now, this brings up a fact from the research that completely stunned me. When you ask people to picture the fluids in the human body, almost everyone immediately visualizes blood. I mean, it feels like the dominant fluid. You get a cut, you bleed.
Right, we can feel our pulse.
Yeah.
It is the most visible fluid system to us, which heavily biases our intuition.
But the actual volumetric breakdown is wild. Interstitial fluid, the liquid just floating in the microscopic spaces between your cells, makes up roughly 3/4 of your extracellular fluid. Wait, really? Plasma is only about a quarter? So the fluid sitting silently between the cells is 3 times the volume of the blood actively pumping inside the vessels.
It is a completely counterintuitive reality of biology.
Yeah.
We view the vascular system as the main event, but it's actually just the highway transit system. The cells are the final destinations, and the interstitium is this massive, sprawling neighborhood between them.
That's crazy to think about.
Clinically, understanding this is vastly important. When a patient receives IV fluids in a hospital, they're receiving them intravenously, directly into that smaller intravascular space.
But because of the fluid balance, it doesn't just stay there, right?
Correct. The boundary of the blood vessel is semi-permeable. The liquid re-equilibrates. It weeps out of the vessels and shifts across these compartments depending on the salinity of the fluid administered. A doctor has to calculate how much of that IV drip will actually stay intravascular to keep blood pressure up versus how much will leak out into the interstitial space and cause swelling.
Which acts as the perfect conceptual bridge to a massive scientific controversy from 2018. A team of researchers at NYU Langone Health, led by Neil Thies and Rebecca Wells, published a paper heavily focused on this exact interstitial space.
Right, the new organ debate.
Yeah, they utilized a novel diagnostic technique with a very long name, probe-based confocal laser endomicroscopy. And what they found made international headlines.
What's fascinating here is how a simple prefix sparked a philosophical debate about what even constitutes a human organ. To understand why this was groundbreaking, you have to understand how we traditionally study tissue. For over a century, the standard way we prepared tissue for a microscope slide involves slicing it incredibly thin, treating it with chemicals, and crucially dehydrating it.
And the dehydration is the culprit, because we just established that the interstitial space is mostly fluid, so if you remove the fluid to make the slide,
the structure just collapses. The spaces between the cells flatten out entirely. So for 100 years, this massive network of fluid was practically invisible to anatomists looking at traditional slides. It just looked like dense, packed connective tissue.
it's like trying to study the structural integrity of a sponge, but your only method of studying it involves completely drying it out and crushing it flat under a heavy book. You'd never realize it was designed to hold water.
That is a highly accurate analogy. But with probe-based confocal laser endomicroscopy, the rules changed. This technique involves taking a microscopic probe, emitting a specialized laser, and placing it directly into the tissue of a living, breathing patient.
Wow.
Yeah, the laser lights up fluorescent dyes in real time. Because the tissue is still alive and hydrated, They could finally see the interstitium in its natural state, this vast, complex network of fluid-filled spaces supported by a lattice of collagen running throughout the entire body.
And the media absolutely ran with this. They sensationalized it as the discovery of a brand new organ. They made it sound like someone just found a spare kidney hiding behind the liver.
The media reaction was certainly hyperbolic, and the pushback from the scientific community was fierce. Which brings us right back to our prefixes and the definition of a boundary. The word interstitium is built on inter, meaning the spaces between structural elements. The core argument against the new organ label was philosophical.
Like, can a space that simply exists between other things actually be considered a distinct structure in its own right?
Precisely. The anatomists were basically arguing that discovering a hallway between two bedrooms doesn't mean you've discovered a new type of room.
Oh, I love that.
They argued we've known about connective tissue spaces for a long time. The 2018 paper didn't discover a new biological entity. It just utilized a better camera to view a known space in a hydrated state. It really challenges us to define what a boundary even is.
It is amazing how a prefix originally adopted in 1895 to strictly define a physical boundary suddenly finds itself at the center of blurring the lines of modern anatomy. But this prefix problem doesn't stop at physical space in the body. It also blurs conceptual boundaries. If you're listening to this and assuming these words only describe physical locations, we are about to bust some major misconceptions.
Oh, absolutely. As medicine modernized in the 20th century, becoming deeply integrated with statistics and clinical trials, these prefixes were repurposed to map abstract concepts.
Let's look at how they map time. The first misconception is that intra is purely spatial. But if you review surgical documentation, you will constantly see the word intraoperative. That doesn't mean a physical tool left inside the surgical cavity. It means a complication or bleeding event that happened during the time frame of a surgery. Time itself becomes the bounded unit.
Preoperative, intraoperative, postoperative. The surgical event is the container, and the prefix tells us if the event occurred before, within, or after that temporal boundary.
And then we move from mapping time to mapping human judgment, which honestly uncovers a rather unsettling reality about diagnostics. We tend to view a medical diagnosis as an objective, undeniable fact. But the sources highlight that diagnostics rely heavily on observer reliability, which is broken down into inter-observer reliability and intra-observer reliability.
Right, and this metric is the bedrock of medical research. Inter-observer reliability asks a straightforward question. If two different highly trained radiologists look at the exact same chest X-ray, do they agree on the diagnosis? That measures the agreement between different distinct minds.
Okay, that makes sense.
But intra-observer reliability asks a more intimate question. If the same radiologist looks at that exact same X-ray again 2 weeks later, do they agree with their own previous conclusion? That measures the stability of judgment within a single mind over time.
Wait, hold on. If a highly trained doctor doesn't even agree with themselves on a Tuesday versus a Thursday, if the intra-observer reliability is documented as being low, how can we ever trust diagnostic guidelines? Why does this highly academic statistical jargon matter to a patient anxiously waiting for their test results?
I mean, that discomfort you're feeling is exactly what drove the creation of modern evidence-based medicine. To measure this inconsistency, the medical community relies on statistical tools like Cohen's kappa.
And how does Cohen's kappa actually work? Does it just give a percentage of how often two doctors say the same thing?
It's much more rigorous than that. If two doctors just guessed blindly, they'd agree a certain percentage of the time purely by chance, right? Cohen's kappa is a mathematical formula that calculates overall agreement, but then subtracts the probability of that random chance. It isolates the true, reliable agreement based on skill. And for a long time, in subjective fields like interpreting mammograms or grading skin lesions, the Cohen's kappa scores were unacceptably low. The documented disagreement both between different doctors and within the same doctor's repeat readings was dangerous.
Meaning the diagnosis a patient receives could literally depend on how tired the radiologist is, or what time of day they review the scan.
That was the reality. But the medical community didn't sweep it under the rug. Recognizing this poor inter- and intra-observer reliability drove the invention of strict, standardized grading systems. Take the BIRAD system used globally for breast imaging. It was engineered specifically to eliminate that variability.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, it forces radiologists to use a highly structured framework. The goal is that a tissue anomaly is graded as a Category 3 the exact same way, no matter which doctor is looking at it or when they happen to view it.
Which introduces a massive challenge for the future of healthcare. specifically with artificial intelligence entering the diagnostic arena.
Oh, this raises a huge question. There is a fierce ongoing debate right now about which reliability metric is the gold standard for validating a new AI diagnostic tool. Do you measure the AI against intra-observer reliability, meaning can it perform as well as a diverse group of different human doctors? Or do you measure it against intra-observer reliability, proving the software outputs the exact same diagnosis every single time without human inconsistency?
According to the sources, regulatory agencies aren't letting developers choose just one. An AI algorithm essentially has to prove it can meet or beat human benchmarks for both the between doctor standard and the within one doctor standard before it's cleared for hospital deployment.
It really validates that these prefixes aren't just semantic trivia. They're the literal benchmarks determining the future of AI safety.
Here's where it gets really interesting, though. Let's pull this out of the academic journals and bring it directly into the real world. Life, death, and immediate patient safety. Because knowing the difference between inter and intra isn't just an exercise for AI developers. It's a documented severe safety hazard flagged by the Institute for Safe Medication Practices, or the ISMP.
We discussed earlier how loud and chaotic a hospital environment can be. These two prefixes differ by only one vowel, right? One fleeting syllable. The ISMP categorizes them as a lass of words, look alike, sound alike.
I think about the physical danger here. Imagine an orthopedic surgeon orders an intra-articular injection for a patient, meaning an injection directed strictly inside the joint capsule. But over the noise of the monitors, a nurse mishears it as an intra-articular injection, or even worse, confuses intrathecal with intravenous.
Swapping that one vowel fundamentally alters the anatomy being targeted. Intrathecal means into the spinal canal, directly into the cerebrospinal fluid. Intravenous means into the vein. You are suddenly putting a potent chemical into a completely different physiological compartment of the body.
That's terrifying.
The clinical consequences of that error can be devastating. It can result in paralysis or fatality depending on the drug.
This is why I noticed a recurring rule in the safety protocols we reviewed. Verbal orders for anatomical routes of administration are highly restricted.
They must always be confirmed in writing. A hyphen or a vowel in a medical chart is never arbitrary. You cannot rely on spoken word alone when the line between in and between is a single, easily muffled vowel sound in a crowded room.
But the logic of these prefixes extends far outside the walls of the hospital. It's baked into the news headlines you consume every single day. Take epidemiology. Over the last few years, we've read countless articles about COVID-19, or the 2024 spread of H5N1 avian flu into U.S. dairy cattle.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, public health officials track two fundamentally different threat levels using this exact language. They monitor intra-household transmission, meaning the spread of a virus contained strictly within the boundary of a single home or a single farm. That requires one set of containment protocols.
Right.
But they are terrified of interspecies transmission, a pathogen jumping the biological boundary between distinct species, like migrating from a wild bird to a domesticated cow to a human farm worker.
So if you see a news alert about an outbreak, knowing the difference between an intra and intertransmission fundamentally alters how you perceive the public health risk. A virus spreading within one species is a localized problem. A virus demonstrating sustained interspecies transmission is the precursor to a global pandemic.
The precise same linguistic logic applies to civics, law, and how our society is physically built. Consider the Federal Aid Highway Act of 1956, championed by President Eisenhower.
The creation of the massive interstate highway system.
Think about the name. Interstate highways connect transit between different sovereign states, operating on the exact same conceptual logic as an intercostal nerve connecting the space between two ribs. Conversely, an intrastate highway is contained entirely within the borders of one specific state.
I see where you're going with this.
Yeah. And in the U.S. legal system, that one-letter difference dictates whether sweeping federal commerce laws or localized state commerce laws govern the traffic on that road.
So what does this all mean for you, the listener, when you are sitting in an examination room trying to advocate for yourself? It means you now have agency. If a rheumatologist tells you they want to treat your knee osteoarthritis with an intra-articular corticosteroid injection, you don't just nod along blindly. You know exactly what that means mechanically.
Exactly. The needle is going directly inside the bounded capsule of the joint.
And because you grasp that concept, you can understand why the doctor warns you about limits on how often you can have it done due to the risk of degrading the cartilage trapped inside that specific space.
Whereas if they suggest a periarticular injection using the prefix peri, which means around, You understand they're targeting the soft tissues surrounding the joint from the outside, which carries the distinctly different risk profile and healing timeline.
Which introduces us to the wider neighborhood these prefixes live in, because inter and intra aren't operating in isolation. They are just two members of a beautifully coherent geometric Latin family that maps out the entire human body.
When you step back and look at the system standardized in 1895, it's incredibly elegant. You have trans meaning across or through, like a transdermal patch, delivering medication steadily through the barrier of the skin. You have sub, meaning under, like a subcutaneous injection depositing insulin into the fat layer beneath the dermis.
Wow, it really is a whole map.
Extra means outside. Peri means around. By combining this small handful of spatial prepositions with the root noun, medical Latin empowers clinicians to pinpoint any location in the body with absolute mathematical precision.
It's like acquiring a secret decoder ring for the world around you. You now possess the analytical tools to read a complex medical chart, dissect a dense science headline, or even understand the legal jurisdiction of a highway sign and instantly decode the underlying boundaries being described. You know why that single vowel matters so much.
It elevates how you process complex information. You transition from passively skimming jargon to actively comprehending the mechanisms and boundaries that shape our world.
But I want to leave you with one final provocative thought to mull over as we wrap up this deep dive. We learned today that this incredibly strict prefix system was standardized way back in 1895 to solve the chaos of different languages, naming the physical parts of the human body. It was built for a biological reality we could see and touch. But medical science is advancing at a breakneck speed. We're pushing aggressively into the realms of human cybernetics, brain-computer interfaces, and deep space physiology.
We're actively creating physiological boundaries that simply did not exist when those anatomists met in Basel in 1895.
So it makes you wonder, as advanced technology literally begins to merge with human biology, what completely new locational prefixes are we going to have to invent? How will we describe boundaries that don't even exist in the human body yet? Will linguists need to create a new prefix for a network contained between a biological neural pathway and a digital cloud server? As you ponder what the medical dictionary of the year 2050 might look like, just remember to listen closely the next time you find yourself in a bustling, noisy hospital room. Because as we have learned today, the line between routine safety and catastrophic disaster might just hang on a single fragile vowel.